The sacred flame flickers in the darkness as you wake up at 4 a.m., knowing that one mistake today could mean death by stoning. Your life belongs to Athena now, and in ancient Athens, the goddess of wisdom demands absolute perfection from her chosen servants. You're about to discover what it really meant to serve the gods in ancient Greece, where being chosen as a priestess wasn't an honor, it was a life sentence. From the brutal selection process to the daily rituals that could kill you, this is the story of religious devotion taken to its absolute extreme. Tonight, we're stepping into the sandals of a young woman whose every breath belonged to a goddess who showed no mercy. And if you're finding these ancient stories help you drift off to sleep, there's a whole world of boring mythology waiting for you. Just hit subscribe and let's explore the ancient world together. The morning everything changed started like any other in your family's small house near the agora. You were 14, old enough to help your mother with the weaving, old enough to understand that your father's pottery business was struggling, old enough to know that marriage proposals would start coming soon from men who wanted your dowry more than they wanted you. But then the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the wooden door, each one echoing through your home like thunder. Your mother's hands froze over her loom. Your father set down the clay he was shaping. In Athens, when officials knock on your door at sunrise, it's never good news. The man standing outside wore the white robes of Athena's temple. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by decades of service to the goddess. Behind him stood 2 younger priests, their eyes scanning your family with the cold efficiency of tax collectors. "We seek the daughter of Callias the potter." His voice carried the authority of someone who spoke for the gods. "The one born under the sign of the owl." Your stomach dropped. Everyone in your neighborhood knew about the birthmark on your shoulder, a small dark spot that looked remarkably like an owl when you twisted to see it in the bronze mirror. Your grandmother had always said it was a blessing from Athena. She never mentioned it might be a curse. "I am she," you heard yourself say, though your voice sounded far away. The head priest stepped closer, his eyes examining you like you were a piece of pottery he might purchase. He checked your hands for calluses, your arms for scars, your face for blemishes. Priestesses of Athena had to be perfect. Any physical flaw was seen as an insult to the goddess. "You will come with us," he said simply. "Gather what belongings you can carry. You will not be returning to this house." Your mother let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Your father's face went pale as marble. They knew, as everyone in Athens knew, what this meant. Temple priestesses served for life. Marriage was forbidden. Children were impossible. Your bloodline ended with your selection. But refusing wasn't an option. When Athena called, you answered, or the entire city could face her wrath. The walk to the Acropolis felt endless, though it couldn't have taken more than 20 minutes. The great hill rose before you like a stone giant, crowned with the magnificent Parthenon that housed Athena's massive gold and ivory statue, your new home. Other girls had been selected too, 7 of you in total, ranging from age 13 to 16. The priests had swept through Athens like fishermen, collecting daughters who showed signs of divine favor. A birthmark here, unusual intelligence there, eyes that seemed to see beyond the normal world. None of you spoke during the climb. What was there to say? Your old lives were already becoming memories. The temple complex was larger than your entire neighborhood. White marble columns stretched toward the sky, their surfaces carved with scenes of Athena's victories. The smell of incense hung in the air like a cloud, mixed with something else, something metallic that made your nose wrinkle. Later you'd learn that was the smell of sacrifice, blood and prayers mixing in the morning air. The purification, becoming worthy. Your first week as a temple priestess nearly killed you, not from overwork or harsh treatment, but from the purification rituals that were supposed to cleanse you of your mortal impurities. It started with the bath of forgetting. They led you and the other new girls to a pool carved directly into the rock beneath the Parthenon. The water was so cold it felt like liquid ice, fed by an underground spring that never saw sunlight. You had to submerge yourself completely 7 times, each dunk representing one of your mortal sins being washed away. Pride, anger, envy, lust, gluttony, sloth, and the worst sin of all for a future priestess, doubt. By the fourth submersion, your lips were blue, and your teeth were chattering so hard you couldn't speak. By the seventh, you were sure you were going to drown, but somehow you surfaced each time, gasping and shivering, while the older priestesses chanted prayers in ancient Greek so old you couldn't understand half the words. Then came the fasting. For 3 days you were allowed nothing but water and a single piece of barley bread at sunset. Your stomach cramped constantly. Your head pounded. The other girls whispered complaints when the older priestesses weren't listening, but you stayed silent. You'd already learned that questioning the temple's methods was the fastest way to be marked as unworthy. And unworthy priestesses didn't just get sent home, they disappeared entirely. On the third day of fasting, something strange happened. The hunger pangs faded, replaced by a peculiar lightness, as if your body was floating just slightly above the ground. Colors seemed brighter, sounds were clearer. When you looked at Athena's great statue, you could swear you saw her eyes move. The head priestess, a woman named Pythia, who claimed to be 60 years old but looked ancient as the Acropolis, nodded with satisfaction when she saw your face. "The eyes of the goddess begin to speak to you," she said, her voice like wind through old bones. "Soon you will hear her voice as clearly as you hear mine." The final part of purification was the scarring. Each new priestess received 3 small cuts on the inside of her left wrist, made with a knife that had been blessed by Athena herself. The cuts formed the shape of an owl, the goddess's sacred symbol. They would heal into permanent marks that identified you as temple property for the rest of your life. The knife was sharp, but the cut still hurt more than anything you'd ever experienced. Not just the physical pain, but the knowledge that you were being permanently changed, marked as different from every other person in Athens. As the blood dripped from your wrist onto the marble floor, mixing with the blood of countless priestesses who had come before you, you felt something shift inside your chest. A presence, vast and intelligent and utterly alien, touching the edges of your mind. Athena was acknowledging you as hers. Daily rhythms, the life of devotion. Your days in the temple followed a rhythm as precise as a water clock. Every moment was accounted for. Every action performed in service to the goddess who never slept, never rested, never stopped watching her city.
4 a.m. First prayer. You woke in darkness on a narrow bed in the priestess's dormitory, a long room lined with identical sleeping mats. No windows, no decoration, nothing to distract from thoughts of Athena. The wake-up call was the sound of a bronze bell, struck once by the night watch priestess. No snoozing, no lingering in bed. The goddess waited. You dressed in the same clothes every day, a white linen chiton that reached your ankles, tied with a simple cord at the waist. Over this went a dark blue himation, the color of wisdom, pinned at the shoulder with a small bronze owl. Your hair had to be braided in a specific pattern, 7 strands woven together to represent the 7 hills of Athens. Any deviation from the prescribed appearance was seen as rebellion against divine order. The first prayer of the day took place in the innermost chamber of the Parthenon, where Athena's magnificent statue towered 40 feet above the marble floor. Carved from ivory and gold by the master sculptor Phidias, she held a small statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, in her right hand and a spear in her left. Her shield bore scenes of the battle between the gods and giants, while a secret snake, symbol of the earth's wisdom, coiled at her feet. Standing before the statue in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the whispered prayers of your sister priestesses, you felt simultaneously magnificent and tiny. The goddess's eyes, inlaid with precious stones, seemed to look directly through you, seeing every thought, every doubt, every moment of weakness. The prayer itself was in ancient Greek, so archaic that even educated Athenians would struggle to understand it. You'd spent your first months memorizing the words phonetically, repeating them until your tongue could wrap around syllables that felt like small stones in your mouth. Pallas Athena, gray-eyed goddess, daughter of Zeus, born from his divine head in full armor, grant us wisdom to serve you well this day. Make our hands steady as we tend your sacred flame. Make our voices clear as we speak your prophecies. Make our hearts pure as we guard your mysteries. By owl and olive, by spear and shield, we are yours until death claims us. 4:30 a.m. Sacred flame tending. After the first prayer, you and 2 other junior priestesses would climb the narrow stone steps to the top of the temple where Athena's eternal flame burned in a bronze brazier that was older than the Parthenon itself. This fire had been burning continuously for over 200 years, tended day and night by generations of priestesses. Keeping the flame alive was both simple and terrifying. Simple because the mechanics were straightforward. Add oil-soaked wood when the flames grew low, trim the wicks that fed into the oil reservoirs, clean away ash and debris. Terrifying because if the flame ever went out, it was considered the worst possible omen for Athens. Enemy armies would be at the gates within months. Plague would sweep through the city. The goddess would withdraw her protection, leaving her people defenseless. The wood had to be from specific trees. Olive trees that had been struck by lightning, showing they had been touched by Zeus himself. The oil came from the first pressing of olives from Athena's sacred grove on the outskirts of the city. Even the bronze tolls used to tend the flame were consecrated, blessed in elaborate rituals that took place once every 4 years during the great Panathenea festival. Working by flickering firelight while the city slept below, you learned to read the flames like older priestesses read sacrificial entrails. A flame that burned steady and bright meant the goddess was content. Flames that wavered or sparked meant she was agitated about something. If the flames turned blue, something that happened perhaps once a year, it meant Athena was preparing to deliver a major prophecy. You never saw the flames turn blue during your flame-tending duties, but the older priestesses spoke in hushed voices about the last time it had happened 3 years before your arrival. The flames had burned blue for 7 straight nights, and then the head priestess had delivered a prophecy about a great war coming from the north. 2 seasons later, news arrived that Philip of Macedon was marching south with an army. 5 a.m. Morning offerings. With the sacred flame tended, you descended back into the temple for the morning sacrifice. This was when ordinary Athenians began arriving with their offerings. Pottery merchants hoping for a profitable day, mothers praying for their children's health, soldiers about to leave for campaign seeking the goddess's protection. Your job was to examine each offering and determine whether it was worthy of Athena's attention. A perfect dove, white as fresh snow, with bright, clear eyes. A bowl of the finest olive oil, clear and golden. A piece of cloth woven so skillfully, it looked like it might have come from the goddess's own loom. But for every acceptable offering, you had to reject 2 or 3 others. A dove with a tiny scar on its wing, oil that was slightly cloudy, cloth with an imperfection in the weave, so small you needed to hold it up to the light to see it. The rejections were always painful. You'd watch a potter's face fall as you handed back his carefully crafted bowl, explaining that the rim was just slightly uneven. You'd see a mother's eyes fill with tears as you pointed out that her offering of honey had crystallized, making it unfit for divine consumption. These weren't arbitrary rules designed to make life difficult. In the world of the ancient Greeks, the gods demanded perfection because anything less showed disrespect. Offering a flawed sacrifice to Athena was like serving spoiled food to an honored guest. It suggested you didn't think they were worth your best effort. The acceptable offerings went onto the altar in the temple's main chamber, where they would be blessed and then either burned as sacrifice or added to the temple's treasury. The rejected offerings were returned to their owners, who usually went away to find something better. Sometimes, though, people couldn't afford better offerings. You'd see the same farmer return 3 days in a row with different doves, each one rejected for minor flaws, his face growing more desperate each time. These were the hardest moments, when your duty to maintain divine standards conflicted with basic human compassion. 6 a.m. Temple cleaning. Athena's temple had to be spotless at all times. Not just clean by normal standards, but clean enough for a goddess who could see every speck of dust, every smudge of oil, every footprint on the marble floors. You and the other junior priestesses spent 2 hours every morning cleaning the temple from top to bottom. The floors were scrubbed with brushes made from wild boar bristles, using water that had been blessed at the sacred spring. The columns were wiped down with cloths soaked in diluted wine. Regular water wasn't considered pure enough for surfaces the goddess might touch. The most challenging part was cleaning Athena's statue. 40 feet of gold and ivory required special tools and extreme care. You climbed scaffolding to reach her face, using brushes made from the finest goat hair to clean dust from the carved details of her helmet. Her golden robes had to be polished with cloths that had been soaked in olive oil and then cleaned until no trace of oil was left. The gold had to gleam like sunlight, but any residue would collect more dust. The ivory parts of the statue, her face, arms, and hands, required even more delicate treatment. Ivory was porous and could be damaged by the wrong cleaning agents. You used water that had been filtered through layers of linen, applied with sponges that came from a specific type of sea creature found only off the coast of the island of Aegina. While you cleaned, you prayed. Every stroke of the brush, every wipe of the cloth was accompanied by whispered requests for the goddess's blessing. Make my hands gentle, Athena, that I might tend your beauty without harm. Guide my eyes, wise goddess, that I might see every imperfection before it offends you. The work was exhausting and nerve-wracking. One careless move could damage something priceless. One overlooked spot of dust could be seen as disrespect. But there was also something meditative about the routine, something peaceful about working in silence while the morning light streamed through the temple's doorways. 8 a.m. Study period. Once the temple was clean and the morning rituals were complete, you had 2 hours for study. Athena was the goddess of wisdom as well as war, and her priestesses were expected to be learned in subjects that most women in Athens never encountered. You learned to read and write in both modern Greek and the ancient forms used in religious texts. Mathematics, because the temple's accounts had to be kept precisely, and temple architecture required understanding of geometrical principles. Music, because many of the prayers were sung rather than spoken. Basic medicine, because people often came to the temple seeking healing, and you needed to know which ailments could be treated with herbs and which required more serious divine intervention.
But the most important subject was prophecy interpretation. Athena spoke to her priestesses through dreams, through the behavior of her sacred owls, through the patterns made by flames or the flight of birds across the sky. Learning to read these signs correctly could take decades. Misinterpreting them could lead to disastrous advice being given to people who trusted the goddess's word. The head priestess, Pythia, taught this subject herself. She was ancient even by the standards of the temple. Some of the junior priestesses whispered that she had been serving Athena for over 50 years, though it was hard to tell her exact age. Her face was lined like old parchment, but her mind was sharp as a bronze spear point. The goddess speaks constantly, she would tell you during lessons, her voice barely above a whisper. Every shadow that falls differently, every owl that calls at an unusual hour, every dream that feels more real than waking, these are her words. But like any language, you must learn to distinguish between meaningful messages and random noise. She taught you to keep a dream journal, recording every detail you could remember from your sleep. The color of clothing worn by people in the dreams, the direction the wind was blowing, whether you were standing or sitting, walking or running, alone or with others. Over time, patterns would emerge that helped you understand how Athena chose to communicate with your particular mind.
The sacred owls that lived in the temple's rafters were another source of divine communication. There were 7 of them, each one descended from owls that had been living in the temple for generations. Their behavior was carefully monitored and recorded. If they flew in unusual patterns, or called at strange times, or if their eating habits changed, it could indicate that Athena was trying to send a message. You learned that 3 hoots meant good fortune was coming. 5 hoots indicated danger approaching the city. A single long call followed by silence meant that someone important was about to die. But interpreting these signs required considering context, the time of day, the weather, what events were happening in Athens, whether any major festivals or political decisions were approaching. 10 a.m. Public consultation. This was when the temple opened its doors to ordinary Athenians seeking guidance from Athena. People came with problems both large and small. Merchants wanting to know if a trading voyage would be profitable. Farmers asking whether to plant grain or olives in a particular field. Parents seeking advice about their children's futures. As a junior priestess, you mostly observed during these consultations, learning how the more experienced priestesses interpreted divine signs and delivered prophecies. But occasionally, when the temple was crowded and all the senior priestesses were busy, you might be called upon to help with simpler requests. The process always began the same way. The petitioner would present their offering, usually something modest, like a small clay figurine or a handful of barley, and state their question clearly. You would examine the offering to make sure it was acceptable, then lead them to one of the smaller shrines within the temple complex. The method of divination depended on the type of question being asked. For questions about the future, you might examine the flight patterns of birds visible from the temple's windows. For questions about relationships or family matters, you might pour oil onto the surface of a bowl of sacred water and interpret the patterns that formed. For more serious questions, anything involving war, politics, or major business decisions, the consultation would be referred to one of the senior priestesses, who might perform more elaborate divination rituals. These could involve sacrificing animals and examining their entrails, or entering a trance state to commune directly with the goddess. You quickly learned that the art of giving prophecies was as much about reading people as it was about reading divine signs. A merchant who asked whether his ship would return safely from a trading voyage might actually be asking whether he should trust his captain. A mother who asked about her son's future might really be worried about his behavior in the present. The trick was to give answers that were helpful without being too specific. The gods, you learned, prefer to guide rather than dictate. A prophecy that said, "Your ship will be attacked by pirates on the 3rd day out from port," would be too specific and might interfere with divine will. But a prophecy that said, "Beware of strangers encountered far from home," gave the same warning while leaving room for the person to make their own choices. You also learned to recognize the signs that someone was asking a question they already knew the answer to. These people usually weren't seeking divine guidance so much as divine permission to do something they wanted to do anyway. The best approach was often to turn the question back on them. What does your heart tell you the goddess would want? 12 p.m. Midday meal. Eating in the temple was a ritual in itself. The priestesses ate together in a long, narrow room adjacent to the main temple building. The walls were decorated with frescoes showing scenes from Athena's birth, Zeus with his head split open, the goddess emerging fully grown and armored, the other Olympians reacting with amazement and fear. The food was simple, but carefully prepared. Barley bread baked fresh each morning, olive oil from the goddess's sacred grove, fresh vegetables from the temple's garden, tended by priestesses who specialize in growing the perfect offerings. Fish from the waters around Piraeus, caught by fishermen who donated part of their catch to the temple. Everything had to be tasted before it was served to make sure it was pure and free from contamination. This wasn't paranoia about poison, it was religious necessity. Impure food offered to the goddess could bring her wrath down on the entire city. The meal was eaten in silence while one of the senior priestesses read from the sacred texts. These were stories of Athena's great deeds, how she had won the contest with Poseidon to become patron of Athens by creating the first olive tree, how she had helped Perseus kill Medusa, how she had guided Odysseus home from Troy. These stories you'd heard dozens of times, but they never became boring. Each telling revealed new details, new meanings, new ways to understand the goddess you served.
The story of Athena's birth from Zeus's head wasn't just about her unusual origins. It was about the connection between wisdom and divine authority. The story of her contest with Poseidon wasn't just about rivalry between gods. It was about the difference between destructive power and creative power. After the meal, there was a brief rest period when you were allowed to walk in the temple's garden or sit quietly in one of the courtyards. This was almost the only time during the day when you weren't actively performing religious duties, and many priestesses used it for personal prayer or meditation. The garden was a peaceful place, filled with olive trees, herbs, and flowers that were used in religious ceremonies. There was a small pond where sacred turtles lived, creatures sacred to Athena because of their wisdom and longevity. Watching the turtles slowly swimming in the clear water or sitting beneath the olive trees listening to the wind rustle through the silver-green leaves, you could almost forget the weight of responsibility that came with serving the gods. 2 p.m. Afternoon ceremonies. The afternoon was when the temple performed its most elaborate rituals. These weren't daily occurrences. They happened when the calendar demanded them, when the city faced a crisis, or when someone wealthy enough to sponsor the ceremonies requested them. You might participate in a purification ceremony for soldiers about to leave for war, blessing their weapons and armor with sacred oil while praying for Athena's protection in battle. Or a blessing ceremony for a new ship, asking the goddess to guide it safely across the wine-dark sea. Or a thanksgiving ceremony for a successful harvest, offering the first fruits to Athena in gratitude for her favor. The most impressive ceremonies were the ones involving animal sacrifice. These required careful preparation and precise execution. The animal, usually a sheep or goat, occasionally a bull for very important occasions, had to be perfect, without blemish or flaw. It had to be willing, showing no fear or resistance when led to the altar. The actual sacrifice was performed by the senior priestesses, but everyone had a role to play. You might be responsible for preparing the sacred knives, making sure they were sharp and clean, or for maintaining the fire where the offering would be burned, or for collecting the blood in consecrated bowls that would later be poured out as libations. The moment of sacrifice itself was both beautiful and terrible. The animal's throat was cut with a single swift stroke, while prayers were chanted and incense was burned. If everything was done correctly, the goddess would accept the offering, and the animal spirit would carry the prayers directly to Olympus.
When out at the crucial moment, it was seen as a sign that Athena was displeased. The ceremony would have to be repeated with a new animal, and everyone involved would undergo additional purification rituals. You learned to read the sacrificial flames just as you'd learned to read the eternal flame on the temple's roof. Flames that burned bright and clean meant the goddess was pleased. Smoke that rose straight up indicated prayers were being heard. But if the flame if something went wrong, if the knife slipped, if the animal struggled, if the fire sputtered or the smoke curled in unusual directions, it suggested that something was wrong, either with the ceremony or with the spiritual state of those performing it. 4 p.m. Personal study and reflection. The late afternoon was reserved for individual study and spiritual development. This was when you worked on mastering the more advanced aspects of priestesshood, learning to enter the trance states that allowed for direct communication with Athena, practicing the precise pronunciation of prayers in ancient dialects, studying the complex astronomical calculations that determine festival dates. You also spent this time working on your own spiritual purification. Being a priestess wasn't just about performing rituals correctly. It was about becoming a worthy vessel for divine wisdom. This meant constantly examining your own thoughts and motivations, rooting out any traces of pride, anger, jealousy, or other emotions that might interfere with your ability to serve the goddess. The temple had a small library where you could study ancient texts written by previous generations of priestesses. These manuscripts, written on papyrus and carefully preserved, contain not just religious instruction, but also practical advice about dealing with the challenges of temple life. One text, written by a priestess named Clio, who had served Athena during the time of Pericles, contained detailed instructions for interpreting different types of omens. Another, authored by someone whose name had been lost to time, provided guidance on maintaining the proper mental state for receiving divine visions. You read about priestesses who had received direct visitations from Athena, appearing to them in dreams or waking visions to deliver crucial messages about Athens' future.
You read about the challenges they faced, moments of doubt when the goddess seemed silent, periods when the people of Athens questioned the accuracy of the temple's prophecies, times when political pressure was applied to make the priestesses deliver the prophecies that rulers wanted to hear rather than the ones the goddess actually provided. These texts made it clear that serving Athena had never been easy. Even priestesses who were considered paragons of devotion had struggled with the weight of their responsibilities. Knowing this was somehow comforting. It meant that your own moments of doubt and difficulty were normal parts of the spiritual journey rather than signs of unworthiness. 6 p.m. Evening prayer and offerings. As the sun began to set over Athens, painting the marble columns of the Parthenon in shades of gold and rose, you joined the other priestesses for the day's final major ceremony. This was when you thanked Athena for her protection during the day and asked for her continued blessing through the coming night. The evening prayer was longer and more elaborate than the morning one, incorporating not just requests for divine favor, but also reports on the day's activities. Each priestess would briefly describe what she had accomplished in service to the goddess, how many offerings had been accepted, what prophecies had been delivered, whether any omens had been observed. This wasn't just ceremony for its own sake. Athena was believed to take an active interest in the management of her temple, and she needed to be kept informed about important developments. A priestess who failed to report a significant omen or who glossed over a mistake in ritual performance might find herself receiving divine correction in the form of unpleasant dreams or minor accidents. After the formal prayers, there was time for private devotions. This was when you could speak directly to Athena about personal concerns, not your own needs, which were considered irrelevant, but worries about your ability to serve effectively or questions about how to handle difficult situations that might arise in your duties. You learned to phrase these private prayers carefully. It was acceptable to ask for wisdom to perform your duties better, but not to complain about the hardships of temple life. You could ask for guidance about interpreting omens, but not express doubt about whether the goddess was really communicating through them. The line between appropriate humility and inappropriate questioning was thin but crucial. The evening offerings were usually simpler than those made during the day. Cups of wine poured out on the altar, small portions of bread left on the shrine, flowers picked from the temple garden. But they were no less important than the elaborate morning sacrifices. Athena was believed to appreciate consistency and faithfulness more than expensive gifts. 8 p.m. Communal time. After the evening ceremonies, you had a brief period when the formal religious obligations were relaxed, and you could interact with your fellow priestesses in a more natural way. This was when friendships were formed and maintained, when older priestesses shared advice with newer ones, when the human community that existed within the divine service was allowed to flourish. The conversations were still constrained by the religious nature of your lives. You didn't gossip about people outside the temple, or complain about your duties, or speculate about your previous lives. But you could discuss the finer points of ritual performance, share observations about the behavior of the sacred owls, or help each other memorize particularly difficult prayers. You learned about the backgrounds of your fellow priestesses during these evening conversations. Helena had been selected because she'd been born with eyes the color of silver, the same shade as Athena's armor. Maria had shown unusual intelligence as a child, teaching herself to read by studying the inscriptions on public buildings. Sophia had been having prophetic dreams since the age of 10, dreams that had proven accurate often enough to attract the attention of the temple scouts. All of you had given up normal lives to serve the goddess. None of you would marry or have children. None of you would inherit property or run businesses or travel beyond the borders of Attica. But during these quiet evening hours, you could almost imagine that you were just young women living together, sharing the ordinary sorrows and joys that all humans experience. The older priestesses sometimes told stories about their early days in the temple, the mistakes that they'd made, and the lessons that they'd learned. These weren't official instruction, they were more like family stories shared around a hearth. But they contained valuable guidance about how to navigate the more challenging aspects of religious life. Pythia, the head priestess, rarely participated in these informal conversations, but when she did, everyone listened carefully. She had been serving Athena longer than anyone could remember, and her knowledge of the goddess's ways was considered virtually infallible. When she spoke about her experiences, it was like hearing someone describe conversations with Athena herself. 9 p.m. Final duties and preparation for sleep. The last hour before sleep was devoted to preparing for the night and ensuring that the temple was secure.
You check the eternal flame one more time, making sure it had adequate fuel to burn through the night. You confirm that all the offering bowls were properly cleaned and arranged for the morning. You made sure that the sacred owls had returned to their roosts and were settled for the night. There was also a final inventory of the day's offerings and donations. Everything that had been given to the temple had to be accounted for and properly stored. Valuable items went into the treasury, food offerings were distributed among the priestesses or given to the poor people who sometimes sought shelter near the temple, and items designated for sacrifice were prepared for the next day's ceremonies. You wrote brief notes in the temple records, documenting any unusual events or omens that had occurred. These records were kept not just for practical purposes, but also for future priestesses who might need to understand patterns in the goddess's communication. If Athena sent a particular type of omen, and 6 months later a predicted event occurred, that information helped establish the reliability of similar omens in the future. Personal preparation for sleep was minimal but important. You washed your hands and face in water that had been blessed during the morning prayers. You brushed and rebraided your hair in the prescribed pattern. You changed from your day clothes into a simple white sleeping robe that had been consecrated for nighttime wear. The sleeping arrangements were communal, like everything else in the temple. All the priestesses slept in the same long room on identical narrow beds arranged in
Neat rows. There was no privacy, no personal space, no opportunity to indulge in individual preferences. Even sleep was a form of service to Athena. But before you lay down, there was one final ritual. Standing beside your bed, facing in the direction of Athena's great statue in the main temple, you recited a brief prayer asking the goddess to send meaningful dreams and to protect both you and the city of Athens through the dangerous hours of darkness. Gray-eyed Athena, wise daughter of Zeus, watch over your servants as we sleep. Grant us dreams that illuminate your will. Guard the city you love from all harm. May we wake to serve you again when dawn breaks over the sacred hill. Then you lay down on the narrow bed with its thin mattress stuffed with straw and tried to quiet your mind enough for sleep to come. The sacred mysteries, deeper initiations. 3 years into your service, everything changed again. You'd grown accustomed to the daily rhythms of temple life, mastered the basic rituals, learned to interpret simple omens with reasonable accuracy. You thought you understood what it meant to serve Athena. You were wrong. It began with a dream unlike any you'd experienced before. In it, you stood in a place that looked like the Parthenon, but wasn't quite right. The proportions were slightly off. The marble was too white. The shadows fell at impossible angles. And there, seated on a throne that definitely didn't exist in the real temple, was Athena herself. Not the statue you cleaned every morning, but the actual goddess. She was both more and less than you'd expected. More because her presence filled the dream space with such intensity that you could barely breathe. Less because she looked surprisingly human. Tall but not gigantic. Beautiful but in a way that was achievable rather than supernatural. Her voice, when she spoke, seemed to come from inside your own mind rather than from her lips. "You are ready for the deeper mysteries," she said. "But first, you must prove that your devotion goes beyond mere ritual." You tried to speak, to ask what she meant, but no words came out. The goddess smiled, and the expression was both kind and terrifying. "Tomorrow night, after the evening prayers, remain in the temple. Do not go to the dormitory with the others. Wait by my statue until someone comes for you." Then the dream faded, and you woke gasping in the darkness, your heart pounding like a war drum. You spent the entire next day trying to decide whether to obey the dream command. Dreams were supposed to be taken seriously. They were one of the primary ways the gods communicated with mortals. But they could also be false, sent by malevolent spirits to lead people astray. How could you be sure this message really came from Athena? In the end, you decided that the risk of ignoring a real divine command outweighed the risk of being deceived. When the evening prayers concluded and the other priestesses filed out toward the dormitory, you lingered behind, pretending to arrange something on one of the side altars.